Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. In this episode, I speak with Emily Kasriel, author of a new book that's out now called Deep Listening: Transform Your Relationships with Family, Friends, and Foes. Now, Emily has had a distinguished career at the BBC for over 2 decades. That's including her roles as an award-winning journalist, so same, an editor and a media executive, and she developed the deep listening approach that you're going to hear about in our conversation as a senior visiting research fellow at King's College Policy Institute in London, pulling from her experience as a journalist, also as an accredited executive coach and workplace mediator. Now, I've covered the topic of listening a lot on this show. I think back to Oscar Tromboli's episode in his book, How to Listen. I think back to episodes that I've done on active listening and what I believe it is and what it isn't, and if it's effective or not. I think back to conversations I've had about listening and its role in building empathy. But I love the perspective and the wisdom that Emily brings to this show and this episode on the topic of listening. One of my favorite things she says here, so I want you to listen for it, is that listening creates what she says is a spacious permission to think new thoughts, both about the world and about myself. It's a wonderful build on the foundation of listening that has happened over the course of many of the episodes here on this show, first as the follow-up question and now as Rethinking Communication, that I think can give us another more informed view of what actual real communication really is. So enjoy this conversation with Emily Kasriel. You wrote in your book, Deep Listening, that standard listening is transactional and that we tend to treat the speaker in this way as a resource, and that deep listening is transformational. You write that listening in this way can take a lot of courage. What is that courage and where does it come from, Emily?
I think that we often listen, kind of lip service listening. We go through the motions. It's performative. We preload our verbal gun with ammunition, ready to fire in terms of what the other person said is wrong, how we can help solve their problems, how we can cheer them up. We're not really truly engaged because when we deeply listen, it's the whole of us listening to the whole of them. So there's something quite courageous in opening yourself up to whatever is to truly unfold in whatever the person opposite you is saying. And I think that's where the courage comes. And it's even more courageous to open ourselves up to perspectives which we know we disagree with.
Why use the phrase or the word courage? What is courageous about that act, or what makes it feel courageous to people?
That's a very interesting question. I think it's because it's a lot safer and more comfortable for us to use our normal habits, our defenses, our script in the way that we have conversations, following a script. It's courageous to do something different. It's courageous to accept our vulnerability that we don't already really know about someone else's experience. And when they share it with us, it may even mean changing our mind. And that is truly courageous.
Mhm. What is it about deep listening that feels so off script? What is it pulling away from within ourselves that feels like this is not something I'm naturally pulled to do?
As somebody who, in my nature, I think really wasn't a deep listener, in fact, wasn't really a great listener, as my family will say. I used to interrupt because I was helping people. I was summing up their thoughts even more articulately than they could. Yeah. And I didn't have much, don't still always have much patience. And so it's easier and feels safer for us to go into normal habit ways of listening, but of course the person doesn't feel heard, and we never really get to understand them because people speak at the surface of themselves. They rarely speak authentically, and it's that authenticity which is about going off script. So I don't just ask you the standard questions and you give the standard answers, but I enable you as a speaker to drive the conversation and can take us into all sorts of avenues which neither myself or indeed you may have imagined before.
Your family describing you maybe as not a great listener. What changed? What changed to spur you to get to the point where you want to write a book about deep listening, Emily?
It was a number of things. I became an executive coach 10 years ago, over a decade ago, accredited executive coach. And that was partly through the experience of being truly heard myself. I saw that when I was truly heard by a brilliant coach, I could imagine new possibilities. I could reclaim agency about what I wanted to do, for example, in my work at the BBC, and about becoming more of an entrepreneur inside a large organization, bureaucratic at times. And I saw the transformation in me, and it made me want to offer it to other people. And it was wonderful to see when I listened to them with my coaching hat on, and then later as a mediator, a workplace mediator, could see how they were able to transform themselves and their own perception of themselves through being heard. But I also led a very big project across the BBC called Crossing Divides, which was a challenge to the narratives that news most often says, and indeed all stories in the media, which is one of conflict across lines of race, class, religion, age, and politics. And instead, we showcased, and I got the whole of the BBC from across news, 40 languages, radio, a TV, documentary, sport, children's, local radio, local nations, every bit of the BBC to tell stories of engaging across divides. And then one time I had to brief 40 local journalists in England who were all finding stories in their community and getting people to engage. And I had to brief them on how to do this. And I realized I needed to find out more. When that became my journey, first at LSE and then at King's College as a senior visiting research fellow, to investigate what real listening meant and how could it enable us to engage meaningfully even if we still disagree.
Going back to that time when you said you were truly heard yourself, can you walk me through that experience? What did you discover? What were you feeling? What did you uncover within that act? What did that person, I believe you said a coach or a mentor, what did that person do for you that you noticed?
It was very interesting because I actually asked this particular coach to share his notes with me afterwards, which he did, which is very unusual. And they weren't really notes about me, but they were more about his own practice. And he was self reflecting about his own listening in order to improve as a coach. And it was his focused attention, his really being with me on my terms and allowing me. And it was like an invitation when you give somebody that degree of presence for them to think new thoughts that they never imagined. So for me, for example, it was the decision to be more intentionally impactful in my work at the BBC. Because as a journalist or at the BBC, you're making great content and you're giving people information and stories for them to make sense of their lives. And there's a lot of impact in that. But I wanted to go a step further. And it was that work which led me then to really showcase the work in solutions journalism and getting the whole of the BBC to tell stories of solutions, not just conflict, and not just problems, because that's what journalists typically showcase. And so it was that sense of being present and listening without judgment, being open to whatever unfolded. And it gave me a spacious permission to think new thoughts, both about the world and about myself.
How do you turn that on yourself then? How do you turn that to yourself and say, I need to improve on this? How do you not point the finger at other people and say, well, they've got to improve at listening, but I'm good at this. You and I are both trained journalists. we could fall into that trap of, well, I know how to interview, but there's a difference in what you're talking about between an interview and really truly deeply listening to someone. I think, correct me if I'm wrong. How do you turn that and self-reflect and question if you are a good listener, a deep listener or not?
I think journalists tend to think of themselves as great listeners. And indeed, I thought of myself because I could come up with the best questions, whether I was interviewing presidents or market traders or musicians. I would think very carefully. I would do all my homework, come up with fantastic questions, which would elicit brilliant answers. So I thought these were my questions. I would be taking the speaker down the avenue I thought was the most interesting and the most important for audiences. And of course, in doing that, I wasn't really present to what was unfolding. So, for example, I tell a story in the book how I interviewed Meles Zenawi, who was president of Ethiopia. And when I went to Ethiopia to record this interview, amongst other output, just near the beginning of my BBC career, I was staying in this Gion hotel, and all these dissidents kind of came from in the bar, to tell me stories about horrific abuses that were happening to them and to their communities. So when I went to see the president, and I'd also done my homework, and indeed there were cases of abuse and suppression and human rights issues, I wanted to hold the president to account. I was not open. Now, Meles Zenawi was a very interesting, complex figure. As well as having a repression of dissidents, he also was making extraordinary advances in his own countries again, in order to tackle poverty, for example. I was not interested. I wasn't curious. I didn't want to understand him. I just wanted to nail him. And as the interview progressed, he went further and further into the corner of his desk. And I, with my microphone, stretched my arm further and further in order to still be close to his mouth, because you've got to be that close when you interview somebody,
Yeah.
between your thumb and your little finger. So, and then he just finished the interview early. So, surprise, surprise, it wasn't particularly informative. And it wasn't that I was wrong to hold him to account, but I was wrong not to also be curious to understand why he felt what he did. And that's what we do when we ask people great questions. We take them down the avenue we think is most important, rather than allowing them the space to go down where they want to listen. Would you like us to have a go doing this live on air and see what happens?
I do. Right after I asked this one question. So how long did it take for that moment with that interview with that president? How long did it take for you to reflect on that and question how you showed up in that space? Like I'm very curious about moments when we come to that moment of self-awareness. How long did that take for you? And then yes, I'd love to get into a deep listening exercise, but I'm just really curious about that.
It wasn't near at the time. I mean, I realized that it wasn't a great interview. I realized that I'd messed up because he cut it off early, quite dismissively. But it wasn't until I started researching my book and I was reflecting um, on how I had conducted that interview, that I sensed that I was not present and I was not curious.
Hmm.
So it took me many, many years.
Okay. Well, I've got lots more questions, but let's do this. Let's do this. So,
Okay.
you take the lead here.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to ask you, let me think, what food reminds you of home?
Hmm. I haven't had it in years because I've since gone gluten free, and there's not a really great way to make this recipe gluten free. But there was a recipe that my mom. Actually, I'm going to back up. I'm going to back up. Um, my grandmother's fried chicken. She lived in a little small town in Kansas, maybe 200 people. She owned a little restaurant there in that small town for years, and her fried chicken was amazing. People would come on Sundays from all the neighboring towns and outlying lying communities to eat at my grandma's restaurant, and I got that growing up all my life. And being around my grandmother's table with my family, eating that just delicious, crispy, golden brown fried chicken. That is the epitome of home for me. Even though that wasn't my home, being in that place and space with her, my grandfather, my family. That's where my mind goes.
So I'm sensing from you, you talked about your grandmother's chicken and you describe it so vividly. I can feel that you are tasting it, that crunchiness, you are smelling it, you
Yes.
are witnessing it when you're talking about it, and you're there. And it's not just the food, it's that sense of safety. Surrounded by your parents, your grandparents, but not only your immediate family, that sense of pride that people came from all these neighboring towns to eat at your grandmother's table, and the sense that you feel like, wow, what an amazing person she was.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I felt special that I got to have that whenever I wanted. Other people had to buy it at her restaurant, right? But I got it, every time I visited, right? So, yeah, she and my grandfather, are highly like, they've since passed, but they still influence me to this day, and you're right, it's not necessarily about the food, but about what it represents and the love and the care and the deep respect, the affection that I have for those 2 in my life.
So I'm sensing it, this huge admiration you have for your grandparents, and also a sadness that they're here no longer,
Yeah,
but that you still feel connected to their values and what they brought, and the privilege of being part of this, an insider here, that sense of total immersion in a space which was so nutritious and warm and welcoming, that gives you a strength in your life.
absolutely. Yeah. You nailed it. For sure.
So we'll finish that exercise. What did that feel like for you?
It's wonderful to be able to share, my experience of the world, my the things that I care about most deeply, the things that have, led to the makeup of who I am as a person, as a man, as a citizen, as just who I am. Those 2, my grandmother and my grandfather on my mom's side were, and still are, 2 of the most influential people in my life. And to get to tell other people about them, I just love it. I love it because they were incredible people, and I hope to one day be grandparents just like they were, because they were perfect. They were wonderful in my eyes.
That's so beautiful, that sense of them being perfect. And also another layer of what I'm hearing is the fact they were very rooted in community, and that's important to you too,
Yeah.
in the local, in the wider community, as figures who people were drawn to, and something that perhaps you aspire to as well.
Yeah, great pickup, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they like I said, it's a very small town, but, I mean, certainly in a small town, everybody knows everybody, right? But, um, I think most what I would aspire to be most is just how they carried themselves. And by that I mean, um, what they stood for, what they expected from others, um, the grace and generosity with which they showed up in the world, the unconditional love they had for their family. Um, yeah, absolutely. I aspire to be that. Every day they influence me.
Wow. They sound so beautiful people. What a privilege to have them as grandparents in
Yeah.
your life then and now. I mean, when I was listening to you then, I was trying to both reflect the words and also the notes between the words,
Yeah.
things that you were not saying, but I was sensing, using what Theodore Reich talked about as our third ear, using my sort of subconscious to understand what was going on with you, and then reflect that back after a period of silence for sometimes you to say more or me to sense make. And it wasn't using only my intellect, I was using my embodied kind of emotions to try and get what was going on for you.
Right.
And there was that mixture of a bit of sadness too, because they were so precious and they're no longer with us, as well as a celebration and joy and a sense of taking that forward, trying to capture that all and offer it back tentatively for you to go deeper. What I didn't do is say, fried chicken, what was the recipe? Or, what was the restaurant like? Or what was the decor? Or how many people came? Or did she make it in her own kitchen? All sorts of questions I could have asked. But had I done so, it would be me driving the conversation rather than enabling you to say what was most important to you. And it's about being authentic. If you
Yeah.
only pick up, if you're arguing whether bicycles should have separate lanes and you only pick up what's advantageous to your argument, that isn't deep listening.
I wholly agree. And to bring the interview back around to to me, that's why, when you mentioned growing up and how you would not have been described as a good listener, um, I sensed something there, Emily, that that resonated with you for some reason. You went on to say what real listening really meant, what truly being heard myself meant to me, how to do this, how to actually listen. But I'm just curious, like, why, in what you've said and how you've described it, why did not being a good listener, why was that not okay with you? Why did that stand out that you would not have been described as a good listener?
That's an interesting question. I think it was understanding that by interrupting, by bringing it round to my own thoughts, my own ideas, it was a kind of supreme arrogance that I thought what I was about to say was more important than what somebody else might think. And that didn't sit comfortably with me. And I wanted to be able to create a space for people. And then as a coach, there's very specific tools and methodologies, but it is that sort of unconditional positive regard and seeing what it can unleash in other people, including my own family, my kids, that it felt like what a beautiful gift, what an amazing privilege it is to be able to have a conversation which is a real conversation rather than a kind of script conversation like one we had just now. I suddenly know so much more
Yeah.
about you, Michael,
Yeah.
like so much more in the space of 4 minutes. I understand what drives you. I understand about your family. I understand about how privileged you are to have grown up like that. And I feel much, much more connected to you. And that's when I wanted to find out, how could I share this? It's like how to democratize what I've learned so more people listens better to those around them and too can share those more intense, more meaningful relationships. It's about the meaning of life, because relationships
Yeah.
are the meaning we have in life. And therefore having more impactful relationships, more respectful relationships, where we truly recognize the dignity of the other, even if they happen to have political views or come, very different to our own, or come from a different background, or people we wouldn't engage with. It's almost sometimes when we have those conversations with a stranger that it could be the most impactful of all. Like just a few weeks ago, I was at my local pharmacy and I was picking up some drugs for my daughter. And they said, well, what's her date of birth? So I said, it's 3rd of July, 2021. And they said, you sure? And I said, "Oh, no, no, it's not that. I'm so sorry. It's not 2021. It's 3rd of July, 2001." And there was a lady there sitting on a chair. She said, "How could you not know that your daughter is 24 rather than 4?" And I said, "Yeah, that's pretty stupid. You're quite right. I feel really silly." And then she said, it's funny about age, because my grandmother just celebrated her birthday and she's 97 and I'm so proud. And I said, yeah, that sounds like a big thing to be proud of, having a grandmother who's 97. She said, yeah. And I sensed in her that there wasn't just pride. And I said, it sounds like you're proud, but there's also something else going on. Is that right? And she gave a long pause and she said, yeah, I think I'm going to die before my grandmother.
Hmm.
And we then spent several minutes talking about her condition and she started crying. And then she apologized for crying. And she said, "Thank you for listening." And it was my sense that, she hadn't been listened to. She was carrying this potential, really negative news inside her, and it was bottled up and heavy. And being given the opportunity to share it, even momentarily in the middle of a pharmacy, was really meaningful for her and for me. And I left not just with my daughter's drugs, but also a sense of a connection with somebody
Yeah.
that felt powerful, and being able to offer that, it was a gift, and also a humbling one, that she felt brave, courageous enough to be open with me. And I, which I don't always do, had the presence to be able to be there for her in that moment.
You write a lot about, and I'll just read you this from your book. You write that we take this mindset that if only they'd understand, we fixate on trying to explain ourselves more loudly, more often, more insistently, but by concentrating solely on speaking, we're missing the point. You also go on to write, deep listening presents an opportunity, never an obligation, especially when it comes to listening to those who hold very different ideas from your own. That woman in the drugstore didn't really hold a different idea, but you've mentioned several times crossing divides. You've mentioned some research and some studies that you've done here. That supreme arrogance that you speak of, how do we set that aside in those moments where we are faced with disagreement, with conflict, with somebody who does not see it like me? There is that divide to cross. How do we become aware of that arrogance and also feel comfortable, courageous setting it aside?
That's a very interesting question. I write in the book about step two: listen to yourself first. And I think when you are going to have a conversation which will be difficult with your daughter, who you're not pleased about stuff that's going on, with a neighbor who you feel has voted for a political party are very skeptical about, with anybody, a colleague who thinks differently, is setting the time to actually spend by yourself and say, "What's really going on here? Is it just that they think differently, or is it that I want to change them? Is it that I feel they should be different? They should think different, they should behave different? Is it that I am just putting them into one box? I'm labeling them. It's called affective polarization, actually. When you have
Yes.
ideological polarization, it's when two people believe very different things.
Yes.
When you have affective polarization, it means you label a whole group of people as being uniform and all believing in a whole host of often negative characteristics just because they vote for a political party you don't believe in.
Yes.
And we often do that. We put onto somebody else a whole host of labels, which often are diminutive when often negative when we are concerned about a particular opinion that they may hold. And the evidence shows that often the perception of another group, especially a political group, is very distorted to the reality. And spending a bit of time just with yourself and asking yourself, what's going on here? What's my agenda? Am I being prejudiced? Have I got biases? And what's perhaps are there any shadows inside me? So I'm not actually listening to an individual. I'm listening to, for example, not that I have a brother, my bullying older brother, that I'm projecting onto that individual. So it's not them that I hear, but my brother, and I feel like I'm eight again and trapped in that situation where I had no choice. How high are my defenses? And then it's about spending a bit more time to be present. And I've got some meditations in my book, just to, it can even be a beautiful breath in and a breath out, in order to ground ourselves, so that when we are with the other person, our shadows and all our prejudices are less likely to get out of our mental basement and come up and grab us when we most need to listen and increase our defenses. And when we use silencers, for example, there's research I quote in the book about our blood pressure lowering, giving people more time to think, to to calm down. Somebody told me in the book, the woman who runs Wikipedia, that she, in a difficult meeting, will have always a glass of water ready and takes a sip
Yeah.
so she can calm down and get back to being present and open with another person. And if something's really upsetting or they're triggering, see if you can possibly be honest and authentic and say, I really want to listen to you. And yet there's a whole load of stuff going on with me at the moment and I don't feel I'm fully present. Can we take a little break?
It's interesting. You use the word honest there, honest with the other person in what you're feeling and expressing. To go back to those shadows that you mentioned, that you write about in the book, actually, that moment of introspection where you ask those questions or consider yourself. How do we be honest with ourselves in those moments about what it is we believe, why we believe, how we came to those beliefs? How do we get real with ourselves and not feel like it is an affront to our upbringing, our family, our tribe, that we're questioning these things? How does that feel, to go back to the word we keep using, courageous and honest?
It is courageous to ask ourselves difficult questions. I remember once, years ago, somebody said to me I was vulnerable, or it seemed as if I felt vulnerable. I said, "What do you mean vulnerable?" And I was very defensive. And then I realized, I am vulnerable like everybody. And I have stuff that goes on inside me and my family background that I bring to the table if I'm unaware. And it's the realization that all of us are imperfect. All of us have a family of shadows that exist in our mental basement. And that's what makes us human. And accepting our own shadows can make us more able to accept other people in their imperfections and connect more fully as human rather than as labels or ideologies. I think it's a journey of a lifetime learning to accept yourself. I don't think it's something that happens in a few minutes. And if you have experienced trauma, it's best to get the help of a professional in order to help yourself come to grips with some of these difficult questions. And I also, some people have different methods of getting to grips with their own stuff. Some people like journaling and just scribbling it all down. Some people like writing pictures. I also write about, going for a walk in nature, ideally, or at least anonymously, where you won't bump into anybody else, and talk it out loud and say to yourself, what's going on here? And maybe even let that frightened small shadow of yourself speak and say what it feels like to be them. And once they have their voice out and they are heard, it enables them to stop fighting. I think trying to suppress difficult emotions and thoughts inside us just makes them more toxic.
Hmm.
Whereas when we acknowledge them, that's the journey which begins acceptance. But it is a journey of a lifetime.
When we've done that work and we've start to turn ourselves outward to the other person, as you demonstrated with me earlier, to somebody listening right now, how do they deeply listen to someone? I mean, you've wrote a book about this, but in the short time that we have, what can someone do to begin to deeply listen, to begin to, as you so wonderfully demonstrated with me earlier, to pull out from people those undertones, those notes in the middle of what I was saying, as I believe you referenced? How does someone begin to do that? What can we do to begin to deeply listen, Emily?
First of all, there's sort of step one I write about, which is finding the space. So make sure that you're in a place of safety, both for you and the other person, and ideally a place where you can hear each other fantastically. So wood, you've got some wood behind you, not that we're in the same room without great echoes. And, ideally even in a nature or even making someone feel cherished so they can feel more relaxed and at home. And then step two is listening to yourself first, having those pre conversations so you can be part of step three, which is more fully present, so that you are there with them. You are not distracted. And of course, telephones best, not only notifications off, but out of sight. Nothing. I mean, who's been in a meeting, by the way? I don't know if you've been in ever a Zoom meeting, a Teams meeting. You're having a conversation one to one, but you know what? Your phone's down here, and you're checking your emails and you're checking your messages. And yeah, I've certainly done that. We are not present. That's no way to listen. We've all done it. And then step 4 is to begin by being curious. It's about accepting that we don't already know what's going inside the other person's head, even if we think we know. And then when they share more, we then can become empathetic and respectful. And it's so important to remind us of we don't need to agree. Listening does not equal agreement. And in the research that More in Common and YouGov did for the poll,
Mhm.
Gen Z are much more likely to think that that listening signals agreement.
Yes.
But once we have permission to discard that outdated, unnecessary idea, we can listen with curiosity, even to very difficult, even abhorrent ideas. And then thinking about the gaze, that's step 5. Really looking, because unless it's a First Nation elder or somebody is on the spectrum in some way, giving eye contact can be so powerful, hard to do on a Zoom or a Teams call because you've got to look somebody in the eye and look at their body language. But eye contact, really, really important. And it's a warm gaze. It's not a Foucault gaze to make you feel like a prisoner. Yeah. It's the warm, empathetic, unconditional, positive
Yeah.
regard. And then step 6 is silence. Use more silence. Maybe you don't want to try 10 seconds of silence, but even a few seconds of silence lowers blood pressure, makes us feel more relaxed and less defensive. And then step 7 is that reflecting back, the very core. And it's not just intellect, it's letting what the person said just sit with you. And then it's almost like it's intuitive. I'm not doing it consciously. I'm just drawing, and you get better at this with practice to really sense what's going on for the other person. And then to, step 8, deeper narrative, include their values and motivations. Because if you follow these steps, you will feel more connected and understood. I would say there's some ethical considerations you need to deal with. Because as you saw in the conversation I had with you about your family, you ended up sharing stuff you probably had no idea you would share at the beginning of this call. And that information that you elicit in a deep listening conversation has got to be treated with respect because the person often didn't intend to share. In a work situation, you might say, whoa, 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 hold on a minute. Are you sure you want to continue? And you treat that information confidentially. And it's also ethically about how you respect yourself, your own boundaries, because sometimes people share stuff which is too much to bear. And you might have to ask them to say, I'm finding it really hard. I really value and feel privileged by what you've shared, but I'm not sure I can handle it right now. Perhaps let me think of who else would be useful for you at this time.
You've mentioned work several times here, and I'm curious, what happens when there's a power dynamic? When you've got a boss who's having a conversation with a subordinate or somebody they manage, what happens in those situations where there's the ability to force change? But I think we all know forced change isn't real change. So how do you approach those conversations from a deep listening space when you know at the end of the day, perhaps you're the person in the position of authority or power, you have the ability to enact change just sweepingly. How do you still approach those conversations, especially at work, through the lens of deep listening?
There's a lot of research that evidences that good leaders are good listeners. And that's a real change because it used to be thought a leader was somebody with a great vision who could communicate it effectively to their teams. And of course, that's important. But listening is super important. Deep listening is especially effective when somebody with more power listens to somebody with less power because it subverts the expected power dynamic. And by really listening to someone, it enables subordinates to share their fears, share their concerns, their worries at an early stage before these have got out of hand. Whereas if they're fearful to speak openly, they'll keep them hidden. If they've made a mistake, if it's not an open listening environment, they will won't share that. And of course, all sorts of things can happen. But it also means that in an environment which it doesn't feel safe to speak, which isn't a really great deep listening environment, employees won't share their brilliant creative ideas. And the whole organization or corporation misses out on so many different ideas, particularly from people who might not feel as confident speaking up. It might be people who feel, for whatever reason, in an organization that it isn't truly inclusive. And by creating a warm environment where people can speak openly, that's been evidence to really change the bottom line in a business. But not only that, the mental health of people working there, their loyalty towards the company, and their motivation at work. And that's why I've done work. I was just in the Atlantic Council in DC, working with their senior leaders and people across the company. I work with in the boardroom of Pearson companies in New York and in London. And I work with a lot of people in corporations to also, and all sorts of organizations to help them create a better listening environment at work.
Emily, what are the outcomes of these conversations where deep listening occurs? Fred Dust, the author of Creative Making Conversation, was on this show, and he writes in his book, having just hard and difficult conversations, if we're not creating anything from it, they're just hard and difficult conversations. And I don't think anybody wants just hard and difficult conversations. What's the outcome of this for us? What are we striving for when we're not trying to change somebody, when we're trying to understand, where I say listen, understanding does not equal agreement all the time, which is very similar to what you said. Um, yeah, what are the outcomes? What are we aiming for here?
We're aiming to understand. We're aiming to connect. We're aiming to enable the person to feel safe to express themselves, and for us to feel safe to accept that they have these thoughts and feelings. So when I did a very large scale project with 1,000 people in 100 countries for the BBC's century year, its 100-year celebration with the British Council, and we recruited such a diverse group of people for me to train in 3 weeks, I thought, I'm not doing this without getting some academics involved. And we set up a control group to see what were the impact of deep listening. How would it change the way that people thought and behaved? And what it demonstrated in the Bedtime Reading Journal of Applied Social Psychology, not, what it demonstrated was that people felt safer to express themselves and more understood, that they felt open to re-examine their own attitudes when they were properly listened to, and they felt more connected. Because there's other research which demonstrates that when people are truly listened to, they dial down what's called their attitude extremity, the strength with which they hold a particular belief. And that can make a whole host of a difference when you're having these type of conversations. And you called the conversations hard and difficult. I don't think deep listening conversations are hard and difficult, because that feels alienating. It doesn't feel attractive. They feel, they can involve courage, but they're also hugely empowering, both for the speaker, but also for the listener. There's some other academic research which showed that listeners in prison, who themselves are prisoners, when they learn to really listen to the other prisoners, that they feel empowered by merely listening, because they feel a degree of agency that they can provide that space for another person. And that is hugely meaningful to us as humans, that we all need to connect, and to be able to do that very profoundly with others, even strangers, is hugely exciting and meaningful.
Emily, why is this so meaningful to you? Why do you care about this?
I would think, like, why would I not care about this? Who would not want to? I know that we're all very different and people have different priorities, but being able to have an evidenced approach which can make a difference in individual lives, not only that, in terms of mental health, in terms of loneliness and the number of people who don't feel heard, and in terms of polarization in society, which stops us engaging meaningfully with people in our own community, in our own families, and people beyond. And if we can deeply listen to each other and be open to whatever unfolds, so many more things can be possible, and we can begin to tackle some of the biggest challenges which humanity faces and which we so desperately need to do. But above all, because it makes us feel human.
Why does a journalist care about that? I mean, I know a journalist is human, obviously, but you've dedicated a significant portion of your life and work now to uncovering this and hopefully teaching others how to have these conversations and to show up courageously. I'm just curious, like what is the draw here for you, Emily? What is the impetus for this work that you want to extend it out to others? What benefit is there to you?
I have been privileged to have been listened to and seen what it's uncovered in me, as I've discussed in a work context. And it seems hugely meaningful to be able to offer it to others and encourage others to cascade this approach to those around them. And I know I'll never know what happens. I mean, if people read the book and they listen to all sorts of people important in their life and to strangers, I won't know. But the fact that we all, in our life to be able to create ripples that are positive humanity, that feels hugely meaningful and hugely incentivizing. And you say, what about you as a journalist? Why do you as a journalist care about these things? I am a journalist, you're quite right, but I'm also a coach, I'm also a mediator, I'm also a neighbor, I'm also a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a friend. And I care about the people around me, and I care about the society and the community around me and in the broader world. I feel not just a UK citizen, but a global citizen. And I want more people to engage, particularly when they disagree, particularly with societies which are divided by conflict and disagreement.
Emily, last question for you here. What's a question that you wish you were asked more about this?
I mean, you've asked me so many brilliant questions. I can't think of anything right now.
There's nothing on your mind that you're like, gosh, I just, if people
No.
knew this.
No, I think, no, you've asked me brilliant questions, so thank you.
We'll leave it at that. Emily, thank you so much. I enjoyed the read. I took many notes from the book. I encourage listeners to go check it out. But thank you so much for showing up, for listening to me as much as hopefully you felt listened to. So thank you, Emily.
I really did, Michael. Thank you so much for a really beautiful conversation. I'm very, very grateful.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Rethinking Communication. Go to my website, michaelashford.com, if you would like more information about this show and all the other guests that have been on it, or if you'd like more information about my speaking and leadership communications coaching. That's michaelashford.com. Link is in the show notes. And until the next episode, keep asking questions.